cool. That's some pretty exciting work, especially when you have the data sets to work with. We're going to open it up to a Q&A session. I'm going to kick it off with one question that we kind of mulled around earlier this week, and it's are these automation processes actually producing better designs? Are we learning from these things? Are we becoming better designers?
I think one is this on now? Okay, here we go. I alluded to this in some of the introductory slides that I had in the context of us as a design community, as architects, being rigorous and thoughtful about the tools that we are adopting and ultimately bringing into practice. And I kind of took a bit of a shot at what I perceive as solution earring kind of occurring within the space of architecture and construction, and that is kind of the definition of finding solutions to problems that may not actually be problems. And I think it's very easy to get caught up in the hype of these technologies. But it's also equally important for us to really take a step back and think about what are the core problems that are causing our industry to struggle. The question I posed earlier to the earlier panel was related to, is it really the case that technology is the thing that's keeping us from collaborating? Or is it actually this idea that we have siloed ourselves within these kind of liability structures and other kind of cultural systems that prohibit these things and are actually the root cause of a lot of the things that we see as pain points?
Yeah, and I think as far as the design tooling, I think, and this came up in some of the earlier discussions as well, is the more and more we're kind of embedding disciplinary intelligence into our tooling. Yes, sure, there's a liability problem, but even independent of that, I think, software always does that to a certain extent. Software always makes some decisions on your behalf and leaves some up to you. There is no such thing as a design tool that is fully manual. Even, I would argue, even as far as manual drafting, there are sort of tendencies. It's easier to draw a right angle than, a kind of funky line or whatever. All the way to the kind of, at the other end of the spectrum, something that is fully automated and makes all of the decisions for you. And I don't think that exists either. So I think it's just about taking a sort of conscious and principled approach to kind of where you want to sit along that spectrum, what decisions are important for a kind of a human designer to make, and what decisions can be rightly handed off to an algorithm. And I think in WeWork's case, we think about, we want to tackle the stuff that is, one, computationally tractable, it's possible to write an algorithm. It's an easy enough problem for a computer to solve, and two, that isn't necessarily something that has a huge impact on design quality, or it's not. I always ask the question when I'm doing interviews with designers, thinking about sort of future tooling, what do you like to do? What parts of the design process are enjoyable for you? Let's not focus on automating those. Let's focus on the stuff that just sucks. And oftentimes there is a lot of alignment between the stuff that's computationally tractable, very repetitive, the same thing over and over again, and that people don't really like to do. So I think that's kind of the sweet spot for automation, and I don't think it infringes on kind of design authorship. So.
One of the things that strikes me about the work that you showed today, and of course the research that I've seen from WeWork in the past, is how user-centric it is. And I think a lot of certainly I think computational exploration sometimes lose sight of, or even I think what I would consider the fantasy of, when people look at WeWork, I think people get it in their mind that there is these kind of push button methods that you guys are employing, and I can't tell you how many people have approached us about boy, it would be great if we could just have an automated space plan layout tool that I could just supply it some boundary and boom, it solves it. And what you guys have done, of course, is actually far more surgical. I mean, the thing that was most interesting to me about your talk was that you had video footage of how your designers were actually using the tools as a way to enable continuous improvement upon those tools. And you're looking at behavior of people to kind of really drive this. And in that sense, it doesn't become these sort of push button utopian ideas. It actually become tractable ideas.
Yeah, and I mean, looking at the work that was presented earlier from TT, I think there's also that sort of shared attention to kind of like the interface is just as important as, you know, as the kind of logic underneath it. And I do think that's really critical because, you know, when we do think about relationships between parties, like interfaces structure those as much as anything else. So
very true.
Yeah, well, at a point that, you know, the work that I've been doing at least hasn't been so much focused on, you know, the quality of the space itself, but on the processes that need to happen for that space to be designed. And the tool in itself is not going to make the design better or the space better, but it can remove all these other processes that are time consuming, that can, you know, over time sort of remove from the quality of the space. So, you know, we can let the designer, you know, do what he does best, but can we check for mistakes and make sure that the architect didn't forget to put the dishwasher in a building, which does happen. You know, so can we have the tool do all these other things that would just, you know, sort of remove the junk and just keep the process simpler and let the designer, you know, just do what he does best.
I'm going to steal questions from the audience and use them myself because I actually have a few for you guys as well. And actually in relation to some of the stuff that I showed, because you know, when we come back, some of this also involves the level of quality data that you're able to collect as an organization in order for, you know, to be successful with this stuff. You guys are in an interesting position where, you know, you're kind of, you know, designer, builder, owner, operator of all of these spaces. And what struck me is the notion of being able to kind of datafy your portfolio in a way is that, can you reflect on, I know that you and I come from very similar backgrounds. We're both ex-MBBJers and worked in design. Can you reflect on maybe what you've seen in your kind of transition to WeWork from, say, architectural practices where that level of control over perhaps data is not as readily available?
I mean, specifically with respect to data quality, I would say that we're doing better than any architecture firm I've ever seen, and we're still doing terribly. So, like, I mean,
I've got an algorithm to sell you guys.
Yeah, maybe you do. We should talk. But I mean, you know, Guy and I, when we were working on some of the genome stuff that he was showing, you know, we're trying to really interrogate our portfolio of data as much as possible, and the amount of like junk that's in there, it's exactly the same things you're describing. You know, how many different ways are there to label a medium conference room? Or we have so many like one-off like names that just like appear out of nowhere and are meaningless, and so there is a lot of work in kind of like pruning that and kind of ensuring that quality. But I mean, we do also have, I think there's a willingness to adopt new processes that I think is maybe less common in architecture firms. Like when the BIM team says you have to do it this way now, people do it. And like that is like it was like mind blowing to me, and that you could just like not only just like establish a process, but like change a process and then have everybody like kind of stay up to date. So I do think that, you know, we've and I think that's as much a cultural thing as anything else. It's about the kind of values that are kind of held. It's, you know, the team that's very excited about improving processes and affecting change, and it's far from perfect.
It's accountability. It's accountability for a process.
But yeah, but there is, you know, we're always as an entire development team constantly working to make sure that data is higher quality throughout the whole process.
Yeah, there's also the opportunities, right? The fact that everyone is under the same roof. Like if you're delivering a project and whoever's going to build that project has to manually count your appliances that you don't really care about because you're not going to be the one doing it, someone else is going to do it. But when the guy who's going to need to count that and place the orders in the room right next to you, and then you as a company decide that all those things are opportunities to improve your process, it kind of pushes the whole company to do that.
It's interesting. I like how it's like all kind of subconsciously tying back to communication with individuals. I think I saw somebody back there. Yeah, Pierce, you want to I don't know if there's a microphone. Oh. Okay, so Leland had it first, and then Pierce, sorry.
Is this on?
Yeah.
All right. Wonderful presentation. By the way, presentations. Okay, so my question is this. I think it was Brian Gillespie's bio that had a clause that was something like, I work towards creating a user experience that should be so smooth that you shouldn't see the work that I do. So my question to you is, are you, do you want end users to see what you do? And I would also ask, have you stepped into a space that has been created with these automation tools, and did it feel any different?
I mean, as far as like wanting it to be smooth, like absolutely. But I also think yes, it should be as streamlined and smooth as possible, and we should have there should be as few people messaging me on Slack being like, desk automation isn't working, I have a DLL conflict or whatever. I would love for that to go away entirely. And that's like, we're getting there. But I also think that it gets back to something Guy just said, which is that like, part of what is potent about the kind of model of internal software development under the same roof with the architecture teams that utilize that software is that it's a dialogue. So I don't want to disappear. I don't want to, just be, someone that they contact when something goes wrong. I want people to come to me with ideas for, improvement, and because our processes change so fast, and it's such a big company that it's impossible for me to know everything that's going on. So, I want to keep that contact and have it be a conversation and have there be some kind of collective ownership over the success of these tools, not just I develop a product, I give it to you, and if it fails, that's my failing. I mean, it is my failing, but like it should be all a team effort to make sure that that stuff is working for everybody.
Yeah, and there's one other difference, which is the product that Brian is shipping is essentially a blank canvas that you can then use to do whatever you want. So in that case, you want him out of your way completely, but some of the things that our products are doing, they're essentially making the decisions or trying to help the designer make the decision, and there's sort of a risk where if you make that too much of a black box, and then people just don't trust it. So in a way, I think we do want to sort of be transparent about what's happening and the processes and how the tool is making decisions, and just have that transparency so that people have more trust in the tool itself.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Brian's resume or bio, what have you, it's like it's kind of a goal you'll probably never achieve, right? It's like the way. But you kind of pursue you pursue it because it's sort of the ambition is to have really good tools at the end of the day. But the way that you guys are building good tools, and I think that everyone on the stage is like trying to build good tools, is through continuous improvement, user feedback, and really understanding like how this stuff is actually going to be used and solve problems. Right, I think is the other side of it.
Cool. We had a.
I think the question was about the end user. Yes, about the person architecture itself.
Well, I mean, I think that gets to it though, because end users, if an end user is quiet, I think we have the habit of, we're all ourselves end users of something, and end users sometimes, and I think architects especially, if I think about sort of my own psychosis. We tend to like put our heads down and get to work, and sometimes we don't complain as much as we should when it comes to like the types of tools that are there. And just because you're not hearing something from a user doesn't mean that there's something not fundamentally wrong with the tool. It just might be that they've accepted that we're going to do it this way because this is the way we've always done it. And you still see people like calculating areas by drawing polylines and AutoCAD drawings and things like that, but they've never really questioned that a better way of doing things. And so in some ways, I think that the point of user feedback and enabling these kind of strands of communication is like kind of paramount to like kind of overcoming that and being like, actually, you should talk to me about where you're struggling, and allow us to kind of figure out ways of improving upon it in ways that possibly you haven't imagined.
But there was a second part to your question, and I'm not sure we got
Have
to
you
it.
been in a space that was designed with these automation and ML tools?
Did it feel any different? I think if we're successful, no, it probably shouldn't feel any different.
Shut up, Brian.
Well, they want to, yeah, I mean, on that side, does it cost less? Well, I think Daniel gives an interesting presentation on like like you showed part of that example where
Yeah.
like certain decisions about spaces, changing of certain aesthetics to kind of make for better experiences,
That's a good point. Yeah. So I gave maybe too flippant an answer. Yeah. So when it comes to like any sort of automated decision making, I would hope that wouldn't feel any different. But when it comes to sort of like the research that we're doing, there are many projects that I didn't show that do things like, when our members book a conference room, they use the WeWork app, and if they rate it with less than 3 stars, then they get to provide textual feedback. Why didn't you like it? The seat was uncomfortable, the wallpaper was too busy, whatever. And so we have done many research projects on that kind of stuff, either through that data or through direct surveys or observational studies. And one of the other things that I think has been new to me as kind of after joining WeWork was the speed with which the research team's recommendations about improving standards get taken up. So they did a study on mothers' rooms, and it found that the mothers' rooms were not super great, and the next project that went out in the time span of like a week used the new standard that we projected. So would I be able to stand in the room and say, hey, like algorithm or research project made this better? Probably not, but does it have a concrete effect on design quality? Absolutely.
Yeah, and there might be other things that are measurable. So, the slide that we had, for example, in predicting sort of sales success, if we find out that the goal there was to find out, for example, do square rooms sell faster than not square rooms? If you actually find those things out and then you reduce the types of spaces that are more likely to not sell well, then you might end up with a building that has spaces that perform well, and probably most likely will be better spaces.
You don't get to ask a question. You should actually be on this panel because you.
No, well, but I'm curious. I think so. I'm going to ask it anyway. So, a lot of the work that we've seen so far today has been about designer process improvement, and then also addressing building performance, but almost always in terms of its physical behavior, so structure or how it handles insulation, or in the case of 3D printing, how you can improve that modeling process. And the thing that you talked about and just kind of threw it away a bit in the end is post-occupancy evaluation and getting to those incredibly difficult to quantify metrics that are around actual performance of the design in terms of its quality. And what kind of processes are you looking at this point? Because WeWork clearly is in a unique position to collect data. And as you said, it's still maybe terrible. So what are you guys doing on that front?
Yeah, so I think that's been a core interest of the research team for a very long time. So a lot of these projects that kind of address that or look at that predate me. But I think it's one of the things that I've observed even among architects who do care a lot about kind of evaluating the performance of their projects is that there's kind of a one way of doing that evaluation, whether it's, sensors or, a survey or whatever. And we try and take a very sort of mixed method approach. So, we are doing a lot of exploration with various kinds of sensing. We have sort of custom sensor rigs, which we're kind of testing out at our own HQ. We're also doing a lot of experimentation with sort of camera-based and machine learning-based kind of computer vision techniques to do sensing or evaluation of space. But we rely also very, very heavily on classic social science methodology. So we have, a behavioral psychologist on the research team and kind of others with a science background who can come in and do interviews, do surveys, do observational studies, and I think that constitutes really the core of how we evaluate whether our spaces are working or not. We look at cultural differences in sort of meeting practices, we look at the way that people use the lunchrooms, and I think all of that stuff ends up channeling back into design process either through standards or just kind of presenting or communicating our findings in a way that's very transparent.
Yeah, and I think there are different approaches in terms of what's actually being done, right? So you have teams that are trying to figure out how to install sensors and everything you can sit off so we can actually track all of those things. There's the research that's being done, you know, the sort of more traditional manner. And then there's a lot of things in between that, in fact, a lot of people could take advantage, and maybe they don't because they don't think about it. But things like all of the conference room booking data, Outlook probably stores that somewhere in a server. Like, can you go back and actually look at booking data as a way to understand how conference rooms are being used? And we do that. And a lot of architects could probably do it so that they're not, in there with clipboards. Card swipe data, we actually have access to that. So, can we look at card swipe data to understand how the buildings are being used, how many people are in the building each day? So that's basically data that's free, and it's being collected passively, and you can just access to it if you set up the connection.
I think there was one question up front.
Occupancy, KT's got an app for that too. We can talk. But I actually do have a question, though. I think in terms of, like, you mentioned silos and data quality, but in terms of, like, scale and variety of data, I think the people at the table are a pretty interesting example. So you have, like, we work with a very highly specific but big bucket of data, and then you have a consultant who's working with lots of specific but separate buckets. So I guess I have two questions. One is, does WeWork look outside itself for training data and making sure that you're kind of not dialing in and being myopic and the way you look at data? And then in terms of kind of proving ground, or I think, Ryan, you were saying pruning ground was the question. But in terms of proving grounds approach, how do you kind of connect those data? I mean, and very specifically, I'm kind of curious about how you're dealing with your clients and how you retain that data, if you do, if you're allowed to use data from other clients across projects, but then, perhaps if we're talking about interfaces too, have you looked at interfaces for kind of choreographing people sharing their data and starting that kind of discussion?
I'll go first. That's very interesting. Yeah, you're right. I mean, you're right to point out that there is an interesting contrast there. We do work with a pretty wide variety of different groups, and I would say that probably each group that we work with has separate, terms and conditions in terms of how, data that we might use for a project can be kind of readily used or reused, which kind of puts emphasis on our end on more about kind of method and process definition, right? On, like, can we establish workflows, techniques, methodologies that, irrespective of the individual or group that we're working with, can be readily and rigorously applied to new contexts. So, the stuff that I showed there is kind of interesting because it actually involved a client that we have a very long-term, long-standing relationship with, which kind of, based on the level of trust that's there, kind of gave us access to things that we wouldn't get with a client that may only bring us in for a very short project exercise, right? But coming from that kind of relationship, there has been a number of things that have turned into readily reusable and repeatable systems, and that's one of the, I guess, driving forces behind our business model as a really kind of small, lean, mean group, right? It's kind of this idea that, we're a limited set of resources, but we need to be able to operate with repeatable workflows and tools that allow us to engage a wider audience. And so we have to kind of think about that a little bit differently.
And yeah, as far as WeWork, I think we have the luxury of a large data set, so we haven't had, at least in the context of sort of building model data, we haven't needed to look elsewhere. I do think that if you don't have the luxury of a kind of large set of projects that are all sort of typologically similar, I think there's a lot of room in the industry for that kind of, like, banding together and finding mechanisms for data sharing. We certainly rely at a kind of a larger scale than buildings on a lot of publicly available and shared, like, urban data to make business decisions and things like that. So we do look at data from sources outside ourselves, but when it comes to building data, it's pretty much just what we've got in-house.
I do know Pierce at one point had his hand up. I want to give him a chance.
A little bit of overlap with some of the questions that I've already heard, but I'm just curious, there's a lot of talk about sort of how you use this research to do the work. I'm kind of curious about how you use the research to maybe get paid for the work. So, within traditional design firms, there's target value design, and the idea that if designers could just put forward hard metrics, they could demand higher fees or they could do more incentive-based compensation. So I'm wondering how your research is or could feed back into that. And I know that the WeWork answer is going to be a little bit different than the traditional design answer.
Well, with the data quality problem and the kind of the application of the machine learning stuff that I showed, the real driver behind that with the client that we worked with HDR on that specific kind of case study. A big part of that motivator was getting back to some of what Andrew described as being able to somehow quantify and understand your portfolio of work. And a company like that is doing, very high-end, large healthcare facilities across the globe, for example, or science and technology facilities. There is very much this sort of idea that, hey, we should be able to benchmark our work and understand it in total, and be able to present our work to our clients in ways that go beyond just us showing a picture of the building and talking about how big it is, And I think that's where the value of kind of this idea of, okay, well, in order to get to that space, we need to think about, okay, how can we actually take the assets, the digital assets that you have, make it better, and make it something that can be compared and understood in aggregate. And that's where like kind of data cleanup and all that stuff kind of stems from. Does that get to your? Well, I think there's also value to be like if you're like say a planner, right, and you're trying to like calibrate and make better decisions about your next project. What better way to kind of understand the conditions you're in than by saying, you know what, I'd like to look at the last 10 projects we did that had very similar spatial requirements and look at where the different spatial arrangement ratios were, and are there certain forms of content that existed in these spaces that we should be considering or kind of eliminating from the work based on kind of new advances. So it's I think the type of insight goes both ways, but I also kind of see trends happening that a lot of those decisions and kind of decision-making flows, design decisions, are occurring with owner and architect, right? So you kind of need to have this ability for an architect to interface with the owner and actually have a dialogue about what's working and what's not working, and and in some ways be able to support decisions based on maybe it's the owner's portfolio that the architect is using to kind of gauge on how they need to grow, or maybe it's the architect's portfolio that sort of suggests that, hey, we have a different way of doing it, this is why, and we can then work with you to make that design decision.
So it seems like it's also not just data collection from projects and past projects, or data collection from different users and user groups, but it's also project postmortem or project retrospective too, right? When I was in tech, we used to do that every time. After every project, we talk about what could we have done better. As we design buildings, what could we do for that the next project can be better? And it seems like you guys are iterating it pretty quickly.
That's something I'll kind of take a dig at in terms of what I've observed happen in the architecture industry. When we do strategic engagements, we'll kind of work with various stakeholders, and one of the questions I always like to ask, so okay, so what's your project closeout process like? We just go on to the next project, and there's not much reflection that occurs in the way that you might see in tech, or in the way you might see in groups like this. And I think that again gets back to kind of a cultural issue. It's not necessarily technology that's going to enable project reflection, right? It's going to be like your ability to talk to your colleagues about how you can be better, and I think there's a component to that for sure.
Cool. I want to thank everybody. We're going to try to stay on time. So a good round of applause for our speakers.